Hi, welcome to the Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully, and today we have Peter Berg and Jerry Mintz with us from AERO, that's Alternative Education Resource Organization. I had Peter Berg on in season 2, and so his episode will be plugged in the show notes. So we're going to spend some time getting to know Jerry a little bit more, and then also highlight both of them and their work with AERO and the conference coming up in June, which I was able to take part in last June. Thank you to you both for highlighting my work in this podcast in the AERO conference of June 2023. So excited to have Peter, you back on, and Jerry, nice to meet you and hear more about your background and story as well.
Okay, well, nice to be here, Jackie. I don't know how far back you want me to go. I go way back.
Well, my first question I usually ask is just like, what inspired you to even want to be in education? Or maybe what were some of those early roles that you had?
Well, I like to go back to my experiences with my grandfather when I was just a little kid. And we would go visit him in Boston. He was a lawyer and an expert on Shakespeare and a writer, and he would say to me, to just sit down with me and say, well, what do you want to learn? And then we would talk about whatever, and it included things like theories of humor, the causes of World War II, the ego, the id, and the superego in psychology, all that stuff. And people thought he was crazy talking to a little kid this way, but this to me became my paradigm of what education should be. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I found out school didn't work that way. So I said, well, something's definitely wrong with school. So I knew that from a very young age. And so that kind of has been a key influence in me. When I was about 14 or 15, I organized all my friends in school, and we would meet at each other's houses a couple of times a week and again discuss whatever we wanted to talk about. There was no adult organizer. We did it ourselves. And if we didn't know the answers to stuff, we went and got guest speakers. And did that when we were in high school. And so again, that was sort of almost like the first school that I started, you see. And so I was always kind of interested in that direction. When I went to college, in fact, my college, I went to first locally to a college and then transferred to Goddard College in Vermont, which is a very radical college and still is. And my thesis was called On Starting a School. And so that's what I was interested in. It led to 2 schools that started while I was there. And one of them, I think I started when I was 22 years old, and it's still going.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so that's where everything started for me in terms of education.
Yeah. I love that this was inspired like right early on when you were a kid and, having conversations. And that reminds me of like my dad and myself. We would just have conversations in the car on long car rides. And that really, you don't think of that as our educational experience, but it is. It starts at the home, it starts with the people in our lives, and it starts with just being curious and talking about all kinds of topics and not needing it to fit into like a box, like you said. So it's really inspiring that you started your own school at 22 years old. I'm like, that's really impressive. How did both you and Peter, and I don't know if Peter wants to jump in or you want to start, Jerry, how did both of you sync up and then get involved with AERO and then kind of just like the work you've been doing together? Like if you want to give a little bit of that background history.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in there. So back when I was actually in my undergrad, working on my undergrad teaching degree, one of our professors in the program knew John Taylor Gatto. And through knowing John Taylor Gatto and just kind of knowing who he was and being a fan of his, kind of started me on that sort of like, I would say more of a alternative view of education. Even though I kind of always had it, I think even when I was a kid in grammar school, I just was like, why am I sitting in a desk? You know, like, why do I need to do, why can't I keep learning about cells? You know, why do I have to stop now and do something else? But knowing John Taylor Gatto and then actually going to Antioch University for my graduate degree. And then just hearing about AERO and then going to the conferences and, you know, getting to know Jerry a little bit, talking with Jerry, you know, kind of staying in touch with AERO. And then just over the years, just kind of, you know, taking on some more things and things becoming a little more synergistic. And I think, you know, fast forward till now, you know, what we're really doing is expanding that kind of idea of, you know, bringing learner directed education to everyone, you know, and making that available and understanding how that works. And, you know, AERO functions as a hub of all these different alternative education ideas, you know, kind of together under one roof. And that's, you know, that's kind of what the conference does, which I know we'll talk about in a bit. And a lot of what we're doing right now is really kind of laser focusing on helping new alternatives get started.
Mm,
So, you know, we have the capacity now to really, you know, to really be a little bit more boots on the ground kind of idea. We have our school starters course, which has been going on for a number of years, right, Jerry? Maybe like 10 or more.
20.
Um, and so this is kind of like a, um, you know, the school starters course 2.0 kind of
mm,
idea. We're really able to, you know, give a little bit more of one-on-one support and in-person support and that kind of thing. There's a lot of other things that we're doing, but those are kind of the main ideas right now.
yeah. Jerry, did you want to share anything about like how you came to creating AERO or how it's grown over the years? Like I've just recently come into learning more about this community just last year through Peter. So I would love to know a little bit more of your history with it.
Well, you know, when I was about 25, I worked on another school, uh, which I got started in 1968 and ran for 17 years. And so that was where I learned the most. We evolved the process of democratic decision making, and all the decisions at the school were made democratically, and 5 of the 10 trustees were students in the school.
Mm.
And so that had a big influence on me in terms of how, again, learning more about how schools should be running. The kids liked school so much that they actually democratically voted out a lot of the vacations. And, you know, they loved coming to school. And when we would use standardized tests, which we used mainly to test the school, to see how the school was doing, the average kid would score up into the high 90th percentile in vocabulary, for example, even though many of these kids were low-income kids. And we had, when we ran the school, there was no minimum tuition. So
Mm.
people paid what they could afford, and most of the kids were low income. And I ran that for 17 years. And then later on, I worked with an organization called the School of Living. And they encouraged me to set up an organization that would network the networks. In other words, to promote the whole movement.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the beginning of AERO, which is the Alternative Education Resource Organization, which I started in 1989. So we're kind of into our 25th year, 35th year. I keep track of that. And, you know, Joe Biden's a little bit older than me.
Wow. I love it.
And and we have started over 100 that we know of, 100 schools.
Mm,
About
wow.
600 in our network, And we have a free weekly e-newsletter that goes to 16,000 people around the
Wow.
world. And about 4,000 open it, which is pretty good. This is weekly, it's every week. So people rely on us for all the latest information. If they want to have a job that they want to advertise, they go through us. And that's the kind of thing that we're doing now.
Yeah, and it's worldwide. You connect to schools from all over. And so that's such a huge network. And I could see this definitely growing now. I think you were on like the cutting edge, back in that time period. But I think this is now finally like a real kind of fast forward movement. I see more people developing micro schools and starting new schools. I think the pandemic's a big part of it. And I think now your conference, I know that it was hybrid or also virtual because of the pandemic, and now that it's fully in person, so we can get into talking about the conference. Do you expect it to be, bringing more people in than say like even before the pandemic? Do you see like this kind of resurgence of people really wanting to get back to the conference and do this kind of method of education?
Well, we hope so. This will be the first time that we will have been in the middle of a country for the AERO conference.
Yeah.
We've been having actually the AERO conference for 20 years. And this year it's in Minneapolis, and we're also involved with the development of another conference that I was at the first meeting of in 1993, and that's the IDEC, the International Democratic Education Conference. So we kind of help organize that. It's not an organization per se. We kind of help it run every year. Every year it's in a different country. This year it was in Nepal, and I went there. And it was organized by an orphanage in Nepal that
Wow.
that runs democratically. It's an amazing place. They grow almost all their own food, and they sell some organic food in Kathmandu in Nepal, and they have their own dairy, and they sell dairy stuff there every day. And it's an amazing place. The kids basically have so much to do with how it operates. I was just reading the notes of somebody who just started working there last November as a volunteer and an organizer of volunteers. And she said, the kids are just so happy.
Mm.
And she's never seen anything quite like that. So we're involved, yes, internationally and nationally. And this year's conference, we hope, will be attracting a lot of people. We're working on it, as strongly as we can, right as we speak.
Yeah, I would say that's our hope. We know that there's a lot of other conferences now, a lot more than there used to be. So I think that's part of it, which we see as a real positive, and it's actually a great thing. And in a way, a lot of like what you were talking about earlier, Jackie, about how, there's a lot more interest and a lot more knowledge about educational alternatives. It doesn't have to be a certain way. One of the terms that AERO has trademarked is called the education revolution. And it's happening, right? It's like this is what AERO's been working for over 30 years. And this is and it's really, there's a groundswell now, and there's actually policy, that's backing it. There's policy that is attached to funding, which we see as really exciting and really encouraging. So yeah, in terms of the conference, our hope is that it's going to bring, a lot more people kind of back together. I know the pandemic, we were virtual, and then last year we kind of did the hybrid just because it was our first year back in person after the pandemic. So that's the idea, is that we want to really just, this year it's just in person. It's not a hybrid. And we really want to focus on getting together in person and having that, in-person interaction around our conference theme is why the education revolution is critical for democracy.
Mm.
And so, we can get more into that if you like,
Mhm.
but the idea of the conference is really everybody is welcome. around the idea of, trusting kids to be in charge of their education. And that's really kind of the main idea. And even if maybe you don't really know, or you're like kind of on the fence about it, and like, I just want to know more about it. I want to learn about it. I want to learn from other people who are doing it. I want to have these conversations. You're invited, and, we invite you to come and take part and network and share ideas and, learn and just be a part of it. And like Jerry said, we're going to be in Minneapolis this year for the first time. So we're really excited about that. And the dates are June 21st to June 23rd. So
Yeah, and I'll plug the link in the show notes. So anyone who wants to
awesome.
register, wants to come to the conference, you can definitely check that out. And I just want to say my, first time going in the hybrid, and I was in person last June, it was phenomenal. And I networked with so many people. I've had now a couple people on this podcast through those network events at the AERO conference. And I had just recently had the CEO of School of Humanity on, and that is a phenomenal school. So it opened my eyes to so many different ways to do education, and also like this concept of democratic education. I did not fully understand that until I got to know you, Peter, and then coming to the conference. And after hearing from so many people speak about the democratic education, I was like, why aren't we doing this everywhere? Like, we say we're a democracy, like in America, but when you look at school, there's nothing democratic about it. Like, students have no choice at all. They don't have any agency. They are dictated all the way through. Even to 12th grade, they have very limited choice in the types of classes that they need to take. So if either one of you want to speak just a little bit more about what it means to have truly a democratic education and what you're promoting, because maybe some of the listeners, are tuning and going, I thought that's what school was. We're in a democracy. What are you talking about? What's a democratic education?
Yeah, well, I think that it's interesting. Peter was talking about students. And the interesting thing is just about every kid I've ever spoken to automatically understands why we should do it this way and makes perfect sense to them. I remember when I was on my way to the conference in Nepal this year, I was literally in an elevator with my shirt, and the mother says, "Oh, what is that?" And so I talked to her about networking, educational alternatives, and and her kid was in the elevator, and he said, "Yes, but what do you really do?" And I said, "Well, we help create schools where the kids can decide how the school runs democratically, and they're not forced to go to classes unless they're interested in them." And he said, "Sign me up." It took him 5 seconds, literally 5 seconds, to say, "That's what I want. That's what I'm looking for." And so then the pandemic, you're talking about the pandemic. Well, the fact is that when the pandemic came along, they kind of reached out to try to figure out, whoa, what do we do now? And grabbed a lot of stuff that we had created, which the whole idea of micro schools and distance learning and the whole thing, you see. And so now something has changed, but we don't really know quite what yet. But what's happened is now literally billions of people have just discovered that they're not necessarily stuck with the local school that they've been assigned to. Where that goes, we'll see. So to answer your question about why is not everything like this, then you have to look at the history of why these schools came about. And you go back into the 1800s, late 1800s, and you find that a lot of the reason to create schools was to get people ready to go to factories, to work in factories, to follow orders, and so on, not to necessarily open them up to the wide world, you see. And so that kind of started this legacy, which a lot of people in education have grown up in. And you've got a lot of people in the education establishment who have not grown up in democratic schools. And so therefore, they don't really understand the idea or believe in it. And so it comes down to the paradigm that you're following. And there's basically two very different ones. One is the one that most schools are following now in the United States and around the world. And that is, kids need to be forced to learn, that they're not natural learners. And that's the way those schools run. And then there's our paradigm. People are natural learners. And therefore, what you need to do is just create the conditions where that can happen and you can follow their interest. That's a totally different paradigm.
And I
Yeah,
would
and yeah.
add to that a bit and say that, you can go back even further than the 1800s and to like the 1600s, where formalized school was really brought about to teach kids to read the Bible, right? To teach kids to read so they could read the Bible. And that was kind of sort of the starting point of really that idea. And Jerry brought up the point of forcing kids to learn. But there's also the other piece of that, right? Forcing kids to learn, and if they don't do it in the way you think they should, and in the time frame you think they should, and they're punished, right? Or they're shamed, or they're whatever, or they're thrown into I don't know, another group, I don't know, whatever it is, right? It's not really about the learning, right? It's about ticking a box. And I think there's more awareness of it. And I think, your question as to why isn't like this, I mean, it's complex because there's a lot of things tied to it. And we can get into that more. And if anybody really wants to dive into it, read John Taylor Gatto's book, something like The Underground History of Education in the United States, something like that. It's something like that is the title. And it goes a little more into detail of what Jerry and I were talking about. But yeah, like interestingly enough, like I've been, visiting some schools and micro schools, and basically what a lot of these places are doing is, like Jerry said, you're providing the space, but you're also allowing things to play out. So in one school I was there, and kids were working around a table, and there was another kid who came over and was carrying like this I would say like a plastic basin, and they were trying to dissolve this like I can't even describe it. It's like it was like a God, like a jelly thing with sparkles inside, and they were trying to see how they could dissolve it. So they put this basin, this bin down on the table, and then of course there were other kids working there, and they're like, well, how are we gonna? But they solved it, right? Of course, there were adults in the room in case, they needed some guidance or some whatever, but they solved the issue, and it was like a democratic process, and no one was telling them, okay, now do a democratic process, right? It was about, okay, well, I need this much space so I can, okay, well, maybe we can move that there, maybe we can. And I'm not saying it was like that right off the bat. I think initially they were all like, wait a minute. But then they figured it out. And I think that's sometimes as adults, even, well-meaning adults, we want to help, and we see that, we just want to jump right in and like, if I just say this one thing, it'll save them 20 minutes, but it's like, yeah, it would, but you
Yeah.
really have to let them go through the process, because
Yeah.
that's really where you grow, right? You grow in that process. And I would say democracy, as we know, democracy is under stress right now around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some people who don't believe in democracy and they say that outright. And that's a whole other thing. But I mean, there's people who, Jerry pointed out, they didn't grow up in a democratic process. So it's even, people who are representing our democracy haven't necessarily grown up in that process. So now the way you participate in democracy is very different, right? You see it as almost like a power, right? A way to get power rather than
Mm-hmm.
a way to process and represent everybody's ideas.
Yeah.
So there's a whole different thing going on.
Well,
Yeah.
at one point, we, AERO and Albany Free School hosted the first IDEC, International and Democratic Education Conference in the United States, up in the Albany area. And it was very successful. We had, I don't know, over 600, 700 people. It was really amazing conference. And on the way home, in my car, we were having this conversation of, hey, how come there aren't any democratic schools in New York City? So we decided to start having a series of meetings. starting at meeting at the Renaissance Charter School, in Brooklyn, and we started pulling some people together. And we had one group that was working on trying to do it as a public democratic school, another as an independent school. And at the meeting of the people trying to start the independent alternative, we encouraged them to bring children, bring students, and they did. But what would happen is those kids would kind of run off and play with each other. And I said, those kids have opinions about how this school should run. We need to listen to what their opinions are. So we called these 3 6-year-olds into the meeting. And once they understood that we knew that they had opinions, they gave them to us. And one of the kids, 6-year-old, said it's very important that the school not have really nice new furniture and be very, very clean, because then you can't run around and have fun and do anything, And so only a 6-year-old was going to get that, So,
yeah.
And so we had meetings almost every other week, and then that led to the establishment of Brooklyn Free School, which is now 20 years old. I just went to their 20th birthday.
Wow. That's awesome. And like, this shouldn't be, such a radical idea to ask even little kids what they want in school, because at the end of the day, it's for them. It's like the space is for them. We are the ones that already, went through the system, and we should just want to help create those spaces. I think there needs to be a lot of unlearning and like deconditioning, of the adult mindset of schools. And I think maybe just these conversations at conferences, on podcasts, more and more and more that we're doing it. Cause like, I'm still in a very traditional space and I'm looking to transition out of that, but I'm having conversations with people in those traditional spaces because that's also where they need to be. You need to have them there so people can start kind of waking up. Because if we're just having them in silos outside of the bigger system, yes, there's change that will happen, but I think we need to be doing it in these traditional places too. And I would love to see a bigger change in like the public and state-run school system. But like Peter was mentioning too, like it's great that they're now starting to talk about money and funding and policy, because that's what, it's the whole system of taxes and how that funnels into schools. And we know the whole inequities of that in our public school system. So I don't know if either one of you want to also just touch on just maybe the reality of like funding, money, what schools are maybe doing to get that access to money and funding, or like creative ways of actually opening these schools and running them. Or I know when I was at the conference, we were talking about how the money should follow the child, and it shouldn't just be like taxes going into, the local school board, and who knows what they're doing with it.
This is actually beginning to happen. The money following the child. I'm a part of another conference that's going on this week. I did the keynote for them on Monday, and one of the things that we talked about was just that there are some states where the money is following the child, and if you know how to do it, you can get that money, and they can pay to go to a private alternative. So there are some states that are doing this, and if this continues to grow, that could be revolutionary in itself. It's interesting, you talked about who it's for, who school is for, and we had a discussion. One of the discussions we had at that conference was somebody talked about the students being the product of what they create. And someone said, what do you mean product? It sounds like you're manufacturing them. And I said, no, what I talk about is they are the client. They are the person that this is for. They should be the one in charge because it's for them.
Yeah.
But getting back to the other thing, that funding is a key part of this. And if the more and more states do just let the money follow the child, this could make some dramatic changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's encouraging, like I was saying, to see that. I think like look at a state like Florida with universal free school choice. There's also a lot of kind of hoops you have to jump through and navigate through in terms of the funding. So I think what I would also like to see is that where yes, the funding is there, but also it's not it's not coupled with stifling regulations
Mm.
or just, all these things that you got to navigate to figure out on how to actually get the money and okay, you can use it for this, but you can't use it for that. And what does that look like? And so I think, a little bit more, I mean, I think we can get there. I mean, I think there's a movement towards that. And again, different states have different regulations. Some states, like in New Hampshire, you can get up to $7,000, but you have to, apply for it. Not everybody gets it, that kind of thing. There's a lot that you can use it for, which is great. There's states like Iowa and then Arkansas, so there's kind of different regulations that go with that. And then you had asked about, schools being entrepreneurial, and how do they also sustain themselves? I mean, I've been involved with schools, personally, but I've also, visited some ones that are doing some really innovative things. One of the schools I've been a part of had a thrift shop that was part of the school, and the students, some students volunteered there. They were able to hire a full-time staff person. So that, part of that money went to fund the school. There's things like one of the schools that I visited a couple of weeks ago, they have kind of a farm to table idea where they're going to be growing
Mm.
plants and things like that. So there are a lot of ideas out
Mhm.
there. I think it's really about being creative and innovative. And a lot of these spaces a lot of these schools are also doing space sharing. So let's
Mm.
say, the students are only there 3 days a week and they're sharing a space with, with whoever else is sharing their space with. They're now splitting costs, for rent, for utilities, things like that. So there are ways to do that. And I think that's the key, is to really make these alternatives sustainable. One of the panels that we're going to have at our upcoming conference is we're going to have a few experts, one who's a constitutional lawyer, who is saying, basically your child getting money to do, for their education is really, can go across, along constitutional lines,
Mm.
so it's interesting. So now, there's kind of legality to it as well. And then there's policy and then there's funding. And then, part of the panel is going to be people who are also working on funding, how do we get funding to organizations like AERO, but also some micro schools and things like that. So,
Yeah, I love that you're going to have a constitutional lawyer on your panel. That is really exciting because, if you think about it, every child should have the resources. And it's a shame that, especially in our country, that, you can go to an inner city with like low income, their schools look drastically different than an affluent suburb if you're just looking at like public education. And it just, when do we just start questioning that, saying that is not okay? Like, that is not okay to have a system where every child is getting completely different resources. And I think now pulling in, like, again, like this constitutional lawyer and talking about like, what are our rights? What are the child's rights? We need to be talking about children's rights and what they deserve. And money is part of it because you need to fund these programs, whatever type of school they go to. So I think there needs to be like a demand of every child should be getting, equitable resources, and that is part of their rights. I know it's part of also the UN and the sustainable goals is looking at that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of now more talk and more kind of momentum in that. It's sad to think about how this was ignored for so long, and great that, Jerry, you started AERO and it's been around for so long, but now the momentum's really here. But, 3, 4 decades to get to this point, it's just, we should have been further along, but I'm glad that we're here at this point. I don't know if there's anything else you
You
want to
know,
share, Jerry.
it's frustrating for some of us. Change does take place slowly. But it's interesting. You made slight reference to it, but the fact is that there are a number of schools in our network around the world that have been inspired by the United Nations International Rights of the Child. And it's interesting and kind of ironic. We've had this discussion that within that statute, it does say something about the right to compulsory education. And of course, wait a second, you know, kids being forced to go to school instead of homeschooling or what, you know, that's an interesting thing. But it turns out that that's not their definition of it, that they really mean that it has to be offered rather than kids have to be forced to go. In most of the world, homeschooling is legal. There are a few places where it's not, and those are battlegrounds. For example, Germany, and believe it or not, Sweden, and even Netherlands.
Wow.
It's not necessarily a right. You know, on the other hand, it's absolute right in the United States, everywhere, in England, and so on. You know, this is they have the right to this. So it varies, but that's still something that's in process. Now, talking again about money and laws, I would go back to one particular place. There is a country in the world that has a large number of public democratic schools. Do you know which one?
No, I don't.
Israel.
Oh, okay.
Israel has over 30 large public democratic schools that really are democratic schools. I visited them. The first one was started by Yaakov Hecht in Israel in the 80s, the Democratic School of Hadera in Hadera, Israel. And I've been there, but it's big and it has about 800 students. And it is democratic, and the kids are not forced to go to classes, and they have a parliament that makes the decisions about the school and so on. So if Israel can do it, any country could change the laws. And we had a little discussion about this in this conference that I've been going to, about the fact that one of the things that we are not experts in, but we would like to see people become part of our network who are, is law and how to change the laws to make something like this happen.
Yeah, that would be huge. I think as many different stakeholders you can bring to the AERO organization and conference is going to make this, I think, speed up. Because you do eventually have to get to, let's see how we can affect policy, right? Let's see how we can start to get into, you know, that arena and like the different like local, state, and country governments. That's great to hear about Israel. I did not know that at all. Thank you for sharing that.
Well,
And I would add that, you know, AERO has always been able to advise people on how to work through regulation that might be limiting. You know what I mean? Not to necessarily do anything illegal or anything like that. That's not what I mean, but say, okay, if this is what you have to work with, here's how you can be creative about that.
Mm.
And so I think there's a few things going on there. I think that we have to, you know, while we're working on changing policy, and while we want that to happen, we also have to keep continuing to push, you know, the alternatives, because I think the more people can see them, and like Jerry talked about the conversation he had on the elevator. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, you know, hardware store, grocery store, like just like that. Where when you start to talk to people about it, and and especially when they meet students from these alternatives, they really start to see like, wow, this is possible. And wow,
Mhm.
I just talked to this student that went to this school that sounds crazy in my mind, right? I never even conceived of it. But here I'm having this like wonderful conversation with this student, and they're telling me about all the stuff that they're learning and all the stuff that they're enjoying. And so I think that's part of it as well. Like, yes, we want to push policy. Yes, we need to do that. And I think, like you said, Jackie, like to have as many people, you know, stakeholders involved, because, you know, Jerry and I are not lawyers. I mean, we've worked with, I mean, I've been a school principal. I know some school law. I know things like that. But, you know, we're not constitutional lawyers, you know, but we know how to, you know, work with regulation and be creative about it. But you also need somebody who can interpret the law. right? And who can look at it and say, okay, this is what, these are your rights, basically,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
yes, we can kind of, sort of steer you that way, but you really need somebody who can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think getting, as like you said, as many maybe young people talking about their experience at these schools as possible. Like I'd love to bring more young people onto this podcast, but I'm sure you have learners that are maybe part of like a student panel, right? And sharing their experiences. But as much as they can start talking about, because when you do talk to these young people and they're having these different educational experiences, they usually sound more mature. They tend to be more humanitarian. They tend to be more creative, innovative, look at the world through a different lens. Whereas a lot of students still kind of in the system where maybe they're not flourishing in school. Some students do, they flourish and they're straight A students and they get all the medals and they're proud of themselves, right? But a lot of students don't, and they look tired and jaded and they're 16. I have students that like that. And I'm like, you're burnt out. You're going through like a midlife teen crisis. Like that's not okay. We can't be burning out our kids and they're not even adults yet. How are we going to have them as the leaders that we want to see in our communities, right? If we're already burning them out. So I think getting those young voices talking about their experiences and why it's so beneficial to them and what they want to do in the future. And like some of them already before being 18 are already like doing an entrepreneurial project, right? You know, Probably working on something with the UN, getting out there and being an activist. Like I've seen it, and I've had some on this podcast as well that go to those types of schools, and I'm just like blown away.
It's
I just had, yeah,
it's interesting that homeschoolers very often will go ahead and start businesses when they're still young. And when they get to a certain age where they would be going to college, they can't afford to go to college. They're making too much money in their business and they got to keep it going. And this is more common than you might imagine.
yeah,
This is the kind of thing that is happening. We in some ways the regular traditional systems has sort of become a way of stopping kids from learning, you know?
mm-hmm. And thriving and
Yeah.
really like being creative and thinking outside the box. Yeah, I just had a young activist on the show a couple episodes ago for Dean Black from Kenya. Amazing. He's actually applying to go to School of Humanity. He just shared that with me. And you talk to him, it's like talking to like someone in their 30s who's already done like a bunch of things. I'm like, how are you like 15 years old? This is incredible. And it's just the power of that, like having all of these young, like again, activists, entrepreneurs, people who care about the environment, who care about humanity. That's what we need to see, right, in our world today. So thank you so much for sharing about AERO and the conference. And I'm going to share all that information in the show notes. Is there anything both Jerry and Peter you want to end with before we end our conversation today?
I'll just say that if anyone contacts us that is listening to this show and you let us know that that's how you heard about the conference, we will work on giving you a conference discount. We can
Nice.
talk about what that would be. So the other thing I'd want to say is that, this is, I mean, even if you're just listening and wondering about different ways to learn and different types of education and just things that are out there. We were all there at one point where we didn't know about it, or we were kind of like we weren't really sure. And I would say, reach out to AERO or even other organizations that are doing this work and learn more about it and talk to people and you might be surprised that your neighbor doors away, maybe their child is homeschooling, or maybe they're going to what we would say in a learner directed learning community, things like that. So just I think having those conversations, finding out, being patient, and not having to have all the answers either, because I think
Mhm.
a lot of people that I talk to are like, oh, no, you don't have to have all the answers. And you know what? Even in the alternatives, not one size fits all. So you might try something that may not work, but you may find something else. And
Mhm.
that's what I would say, is to stick with that idea that yes, there's alternatives, but you will find the right fit, and you will figure it out. It might take a little time, but you will.
Great.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, well, all right. Well, the AERO website is educationrevolution.org. Educationrevolution.org. And Peter, the conference website
is AEROconference.org.
very complex.
Love it. I'll plug all of that too. Well, it's so
Awesome.
nice getting to know you, Jerry, since this is our first time meeting and chatting, and nice seeing you again, Peter. I am sorry I cannot be there in person this June because I will be in Bali. Sorry. But I will, it just happened to be that time.
Yeah.
But I am so excited.
There's a couple of schools in Bali that are part of our network. So which
Oh, yeah.
are you going to? The Green School?
Well, I'm going to go visit the Green School. Yeah, I've had Kenny Peavy on the podcast. He's a teacher there. And my friend who I'm traveling with, she's kind of like thinking about, because she's like on her own, she's like, maybe if I find a school there that I like and they have an opening, maybe I won't come home. So it'll be quite an experience.
There's another one there. I'm just going off the top of my head, something like Sunset School or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
You'll see.
Yeah. Yeah,
Look
we
at-
definitely want to check out the schools.
Look on the AERO website, educationrevolution.org, and then you can look at member schools, schools we
Yeah.
help start, all that, democratic schools.
Jerry, isn't
Yeah.
Paul Friedman in Bali? Doesn't he have a school or was part of a school that started? And maybe that's the Green School. I'll have to ask him because I connect with him sometimes. But
Great.
yeah.
Well, I can't wait to hear all about the conference, and I will definitely want to be part of that in the future for like the next conference. So I'm really excited for you. I'm excited that it's in the Midwest. That's so cool to pull in people from all over.
Yeah.
You get people from all over, like, you know, from different countries too. It was awesome to see that last year. So I'm sure even more so. I'm really excited. So thank you both for coming on the Teacher's Story and sharing all about AERO.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.